So let's start with the recording. So, hi everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mosleh, who's here in person today, which is a great privilege. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter Business School, and a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, and a research affiliate at MIT. Mohsen's research interest lie in the intersection of data science and cognitive science and a lot of the stuff that we do here in the lab. So thank you so much for coming. I think you're the only, you now been here in person, but you presented last year, right?
Yes, at the beginning.
Yeah, the beginning. So
beginning of the term.
That's great having to see what's been up with your new research.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here and be here in person. So this is a project that I've done together with Dave Rand at MIT, focusing on measuring misinformation from political elite. So the paper came out back in December 2022, like last year, in Nature Communications. So without further ado, let's get started. So the cornerstone of research about misinformation and fake news is how to measure this kind of problematic content, how to identify this kind of problematic content on social media platforms. One common way to do that is to use a list of domains or URLs from fact-checking websites, content that were found to be false by the fact-checking websites, or having groups of professional fact-checkers rating news domain or sources from 0 to 1 or into different categories, and then use that in order to quantify quality of content or trustworthiness of the content people share on social media. One shortcoming of that is that these are mostly debunk articles from rapidly changing, untrustworthy domains, websites that are around before the election for a few months and they're just go away. So it's hard to keep track of these kind of websites, and also there's no standard way to identify these kind of problematic websites or problematic content. Another shortcoming of using domain sharing approach to measure misinformation is that it doesn't account for misinformation that comes from political elites. So elite here meaning major political figures or organizations that have many or millions of followers on social media. So information they share can be exposed to a large number of users. And sometimes they make false claims, as you can see here, false claims by Republican about widespread fraud in 2020 US election. And I would say this is an even more major issue comparing to random fake news websites. Another thing is that focusing on the sharing content that accounts for active engagement of the users with the content in terms of retweeting, reposting, or sharing this kind of content. It doesn't account for passive exposure to those kind of problematic content. It's users may not share this kind of content, but they may see it so that they're exposed to that kind of problematic content. So just one quick example of this kind of misinformation from elites. This is the scorecard for Donald Trump, previous U.S. President, and you can see more than half of the statements that were fact-checked by PolitiFact were found to be somehow problematic, even mostly false, and pants on fire. And at the time, Donald Trump had more than 80 million followers on Twitter, for example. So all these people were kind of exposed to this kind of false content or problematic content. So we seek out to introduce a approach to measure this kind of exposure to elite misinformation by collecting the information from fact-checking website, and here specifically focused on PolitiFact, to the associated Twitter account of the political elites. So for all the political elites for which we have fact-checking scores from PolitiFact, we found the associated Twitter handles. That is the database from the PolitiFact, more than 800 public figures and organizations for which we have these fact-checking scores from PolitiFact, and then we found the associated Twitter handles for this user, such that we can calculate some falsity score for the users, for the accounts on Twitter. So these are the falsity ratings from, PolitiFact. So for every statement that's fact-checked by PolitiFact, we have these ratings from true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, and pants on fire. And we map that into a linear scheme of scores from 0 all the way to 1. And if you use any other linear scheme for this, what I'm presenting holds true as well. So looking at this database of more than 800 Twitter accounts and their associated fact-checking scores, so we have like a distribution of the number of fact checks per each elite, and then we have like the number of ratings per each category. This is the distribution of the falsity score, basically the average of the false claims they made were fact-checked by PolitiFact, and these are the followers and the number of elites followed by each user for each sample in our study. So in order to come up with this misinformation, in order to measure this exposure to misinformation, we created this simple scheme for calculating the misinformation exposure score by finding the average falsity ratings of all elites a user follows on Twitter. So each elite, based on their fact-checking scores from PolitiFact, they have like a falsity rating from 0 to 1. And then for each user on Twitter, we can calculate this misinformation exposure score by averaging over all falsity score ratings of elites they follow on Twitter. We use this simple averaging here. If you do more kind of like fancy IRT, item response theory method, the results would be also the same. So for each Twitter user who follows a couple of these political elites, we can calculate this misinformation exposure score. So the question here is that what's the characteristics of users who follow more problematic elites? What's the characteristics of users who follow elites with high falsity rating? Or in other words, how misinformation exposure score relates to different characteristics of the users on Twitter. To address this question, we created a sample of 5,000 Twitter users who followed at least 3 rated elites from PolitiFact. We calculated all their tweets and the users they follow. We estimated their political ideology, toxicity of the language they use, and quality of content they share using domain sharing approach. And then we investigated the users commonly followed and domains commonly shared by these users, comparing against the misinformation exposure score. So having done that, the first thing we wanted to do is just to see how misinformation exposure score relates to other metrics for identifying quality of content users share. So on the x-axis, I have the misinformation exposure score through the approach I just described. And on the y-axis, I have the quality of content users shared on Twitter using a list of 60 domains for which we have professional fact checkers trustworthiness rating. As part of another study, this is a 60 domain, 20 mainstream, 20 hyperpartisan, 20 fake news websites. This is from the PNAS paper by Pennycook and Rand 2018. So if you look at the relationship between exposure to misinformation from our metric, we find that users who are more exposed to misinformation from political elites are also more likely to share content from websites than professional fact checkers from.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, okay. So the sharing quality ratings, does that include links those people got from the elites?
Not necessarily. These are
but they are in there.
These are like 16 news websites, which I believe doesn't include that's a good question, but I believe not necessarily.
Okay. Okay, so in other words, the users are trying hard to share bad information. It isn't just that they take stuff from.
No.
Okay, right.
But it doesn't include retweets, right?
Sorry?
It does include the retweets. So whether the retweeting, like the.
Yeah, but the y-axis only is the domains.
Yeah. No, I understand that why I said domains, but the domains come from, well, it could come from either them sharing spontaneously or from the
That's
retweets.
correct. Yeah, that's correct. But the good robustness checks for that would be like, we can also just do it for primary tweets.
Yeah.
So that's just accurate. But that's a good comment. And I know there are other lists, for example, for the recent paper from this group, the PNAS Nexus paper, what you
Yeah,
have.
Sigurd was one of the authors.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be interesting to do the same thing using that list of more than 5,000 domains, I believe, so we can see a similar pattern maybe. So, and one question about using the professional fact checkers trustworthiness rating is that these are mostly like left-leaning people, so there could be like some political bias there. So we also look at the relationship between misinformation exposure score and quality of content rated by a crowd of politically balanced crowd of people, like lay people from NTERC and Mosleh, and we found similar patterns. So users who are more exposed to misinformation from political elite, also more likely to share content from low quality websites or websites that a politically balanced crowd of people found as less trustworthy. We also look at the relationship between misinformation exposure score and estimated political ideology of the user. To estimate users' political ideology, we use this method from Barbara 2015, where we estimate users' ideology on a scale of -21 to 21 in a continuous scale based on the accounts they followed. It's like based on the item response theory method. So we found that users who are having like more conservative ideology more likely to be exposed to misinformation. And this is aligned with other prior work showing that more conservative ideology is more associated with sharing low quality content.
Well, and it's an interesting pattern too. It's not just this linear effect. It's like everyone has this kind of middle amount until you get to the high levels, and then it just.
I get back to that, to this kind of asymmetry in political ideology, and I'll get back to that. You can interpret it as how extremity of ideology relates to sharing misinformation, how that's different from Republican versus Democratic. And we also measure language toxicity or average use of language toxicity in your tweets, and this is using the Google Jigsaw Perspective API to rate the toxicity of the language used in their tweets from 0 to 1, and then compare that to the misinformation exposure score. We found that users are more exposed to misinformation are also more likely to use toxic language.
But it's a smaller effect.
It's smaller.
And is toxicity the same as civility or lack of civility?
That's a good question. But the challenge of using this API is just kind of a black box.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to see, and I've seen people have the validation using like Lucid, for example, to see like, not Lucid, I'm sorry, Luke, LIWC. Sorry for that. So we can look at that and see like, what are the common words they use and try to interpret that. That would be one way to do that. Or another way to try to interpret the results is to use this structural topic model to see when they talk about them, to see how different use of topics within the tweets relates to use of toxic language, and see like what kind of topics pops out. Is it like they swear more, or is it like they use hateful language against particular groups of people? So I think
it's just reminds me we had not that long ago, like a discussion about this algorithm, right? And then there was this paper, and then one showed like what contributes to toxicity of the language, because it showed like more toxicity in liberal than in conservatives. So it will be, yeah, it's an interesting question of how we need to try to make these types of APIs transparent, so we know what's the driving idea behind them.
I mean, sure.
No, sorry, no, go ahead.
No, just a quick comment. I think the way that they did it, they had like this large data set of annotated tweets, or annotated basically content, and then they trained this model. So it would be interesting to, I don't know even they know themselves, like what kind of features the algorithm picks up.
Yeah.
But I've seen like, there's a paper by Rob Willer at Stanford where they did kind of like validation across different types of words they use and things like that. They found like it's pretty much, along with like other use of like dictionary-based method.
Yeah.
So I may have missed that, but this is language toxicity of what exactly? All the tweets of the accounts that you mentioned?
Yeah.
So not only those that contain those information, like link, everything. Okay.
But also like, back to the previous question, I think it makes sense to do it also for just primary tweet.
Okay, because this includes retweets.
It equals everything.
Okay.
Replies, retweets, tweets, quotes. And another thing is interesting, looking at the replies, particularly as
Yeah.
things get nasty in replies. So.
Yeah.
So that was mainly looking at the individual tweets and individual users and how that relates to other characteristics we could estimate from users, public profile. Another analysis that we did using this measure was looking at the more kind of like network level features of these users. So mainly focusing on accounts followed by users with high versus low quality exposure to misinformation. So we created this bipartite network of users and the accounts they followed. So, there is a link between a user and account they followed if there is that user followed that account. So for our accounts that are followed by users within our sample more than 20 times, so we have a set of mostly common users who commonly followed accounts from our sample, we created this monograph. So every node in this graph is an account that is followed by at least 20 users in our sample. And the link between these two accounts showed the common followers from our sample. So two nodes are connected in this network if there is at least one mutual followers from our sample. And these are weighted graphs. So the weight is higher, they share more followers. So we are looking at this co-follower network, which represents the accounts that are shared, that are followed by at least 20 users from our sample. And then for the features of each node, we aggregated the characteristics of users who follow that account. So for each user, for each account here, we average over the political ideology, language toxicity, misinformation exposure, and all those characteristics of the followers of this account.
So, sorry, just to be clear on this, what you call users are the people who follow one of your elites. Is that correct?
Yes, so for users, these are the 5,000 users who follow this elites.
Okay, fine, which you have sampled from before.
Yeah.
Right, okay, and then you look at all the other accounts they follow.
Exactly.
Okay, fine.
But because there could be millions of accounts they follow, we just focus on those who were followed at least 20 times from our sample.
Oh, I see. Across the 5,000, you only consider accounts that are followed by 20 people at least.
At least 20 of the 5,000.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
So looking at the structure of this co-follower network, so this, we end up with 6,000, 7,000 of the accounts that are followed at least 20 times by people from our sample. So in order to look at the structure of this network, we use this Louvain algorithm to find communities within the network. So this Louvain algorithm just basically finds clusters of nodes within the network. So a cluster of nodes are nodes who are well connected but less connected to other nodes. In the way that we constructed this co-follower network, that means that nodes that share more followers end up being in the same cluster. And then we found 3 main clusters within this network. And then we look at the clusters of these accounts. So these are the most the accounts with highest followers within each cluster. In cluster 1, we have like more kind of like left-leaning accounts like Obama, Biden, Hillary Clinton, Harris, and so on. Cluster 2, kind of in the middle, or maybe like center left, New York Times, Associated Press, Washington Post, and CNN. And cluster 3 are most kind of like right-leaning accounts like White House 45 Archive, President Trump, Melania Trump, and so on. Looking at the characteristics of these accounts represented by the average characteristics of their followers, you can see the cluster on the right is more exposed to misinformation. That's like accounts that follow this, the users who follow this account are more exposed to misinformation. And then looking at the figure on the right, looking at the average political ideology of these people, they're more kind of like right-leaning people. And it's kind of like, is it another piece of evidence for what we just showed in terms of like conservative being more exposed to misinformation, sharing more misinformation. We did similar analysis for the content that the users shared within our sample. So instead of user versus accounts they follow, we created this bipartite network of users and the websites they share. So for all the users, we extracted the domains they share, and these are not only the rated domains, every domain they share content from. And we created this bipartite network of users and websites they share. And then we then collapsed it into the monograph of this co-shared network. So each node in this network represents a domain that's shared at this, let's say 50 times by the user in our sample. And the connection between 2 nodes represents the user, common share, or a user who shares the users who commonly share from those domains. And then similar to the co-follower network, each domain is represented by the average characteristics of the users who share that domain, like average ideology, average toxicity, misinformation exposure, and so on. Similar to the previous network, we did this, Louvain algorithm to find the clusters of the accounts, and we can see similar pattern here. So the cluster 1 is, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Politico, and so on. And then we have a cluster kind of like in the middle, maybe like center left, and then we have a cluster 3, which is like more kind of right-leaning domains. And if we look at the characteristics of this user, we see like similar patterns. Like we have a set of domains that are mostly shared by people who are more exposed to misinformation, and these people show conservative ideology.
So the top accounts in each cluster that you just show, are they ranked?
They're ranked by the number of times they shared, or number of times they follow.
Okay, so not about, so they're not ranked with the respective weight in the cluster. Okay.
There's like several different ways we could do that. We just end up using the simple way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just asking because I'm thinking of the more right-leaning cluster, and I see more like what's the term that the like Wall Street Journal and then Fox News are more like legacy, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder about like the weight in the different clusters of like say the more non-traditional like right versus
I don't know, one way to do that could be like maybe we can look at sub-centrality measure within that network.
Right. Yeah.
See whether the central nodes.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so cluster two, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that it's this kind of center, but it also seems to be a lot of like just non-political, nonpartisan, just like removed from the spectrum type sites like ESPN or apple.com.
Exactly. It could be like, just a gray area.
What's go.com? Do we know? Anybody know? Okay, well, never mind. I can look it up. I was just wondering what it is. Never come across it.
Some of these are like websites that, for like,
Aggregators or
yeah,
something?
like some maybe, like, I don't know, maybe like Disney Go. So it's like,
Oh. There we go.
Ah, okay. Thank you, Christoph. Yes, that explains.
Disney Go.
Can I quickly intervene? Because I was wondering about one thing, just because I looked the website up. The Hill, I haven't had the appearance that's super right-leaning. I would say it's like leaning towards the left. And I just looked it up, and it's indeed judged as potentially more left-leaning. Is there like an outsider here?
Yeah, but it could be like related to what Amon said. It could be like because we are ranking based on the traffic. So we're just like showing the highest traffic websites here in each cluster. That's might not be exactly representative of like how those websites distinguish the clusters.
So it's traffic overall to the website,
Kind of like, I mean, like
outside
traffic,
the
I mean,
clusters.
yeah, I mean like the number of shares
Oh, within the clusters.
within the clusters.
Within the clusters.
But not necessarily how central it is to
Yes.
that cluster, like how just
So
beneficial it is.
exactly, the way that I think about it, like you can think about like how sharing from a website could be a representative of one's ideology, whether like, Breitbart might be like a very good representative of someone's ideology, whereas Fox News may not be that representative because many people share from Fox News. So I think that's a valid comment here, just like, trying to see what are the representative versus those that are receive like highest share. And we did, again, similar network for co-retweets. So every account, so we created this bipartisan network of users and accounts they retweeted from, and then collapsed into a co-retweet network. So each node in this network is an account that's retweeted by 20, 30 users in our sample. And then we look at the structure within this network. We did the Google algorithm, created the clusters and so on. But we found similar pattern, like a cluster more kind of like left, kind of center, or like non-political, and one on the right is more. But interesting thing about this network is like kind of like more polarized, because kind of like retweets represents more about endorsing someone's idea rather than just like following them.
Yeah.
So that's gonna like show that pattern here as well. We don't have, I think I did in the paper, but if you look at the size of the clusters, the one in the middle this time is very small compared to the other two. So that just coming back to the comment that Lisa mentioned earlier in the presentation. So looking at the ideological extremity here and misinformation that users are exposed to. So look at this pattern, we see that ideological extremity measured by the absolute value of the estimated ideology from this Barbero method, we can see that there is a strong association between ideological extremity and being exposed to misinformation for right-leaning people, but there is not much strong association if you look at people on the left. If you look at the stats, there's a very, very tiny coefficient for the people on the left compared to the people on the right, even though it's significant. And we look at this pattern using other method for estimating political ideology. This is based on the accounts they follow. There's another method from Greg if I'm not mistaken, looking at estimating people's political ideology based on the news domains they share content from, and we can see a similar pattern as well. And we built this website to estimate people exposure to misinformation as well as estimate people's political ideology based on the accounts or elites they follow on Twitter. And this provides also an open access API, so you can just send a list of Twitter users or Twitter user IDs to the website, either as screen names or user IDs, to get the political misinformation exposure score, elites they followed, and the political ideology of the user as well. And this contains more than 300 million Twitter users already pre-calculated scores, which is more than half of the active Twitter users on the platform.
So the partisanship that you get here is just applying the Barbera method?
No, so the way that we did it was very simple. We know the ideology of the elites, and then we find the average. So the way we did it, like for Democrats, we have one. So Democrats we have -1, for Republican we have 1, and then based on that, elites you follow, we get the average.
Oh, okay. So
Comparing this with Barbera method, you get more than 90% correlation.
yeah, so I see. It's just like classified as either Republican or Democrat, and then you look into the followership network and then aggregating.
Exactly. And also Barbera method, if you look at the continuous measure, it's not great around 0, so you have kind of a bias. If you look at people who are not much politically engaged, you will get many misclassification. Even here, if you look at it 0, you would expect this would be around 0.9 or 0.8. So it's not doing a great job in terms of classification in this bound.
Well, apparently I'm a Democrat.
Yeah, yeah, you're at the -1, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But my misinformation exposure is 0.461, which is only 10% lower than average.
Yeah, I would say you're a big vector of misinformation.
I must be. I wonder. Yeah, interesting.
Don't follow any elites. Yeah, me too.
Tom's got a sensible Twitter account.
Turns out Steve is not considered an elite.
How worried are you about the new Twitter API and how people might be able to use this with now being more?
Oh, having to pay and all that.
Yeah, with more restrictions on the Twitter API.
So the way we need to see how things evolve with Twitter, but this data we already gathered. We need just to update it over time. There's just another problem, but this one you can use it without relying on Twitter.
Oh, wait, so if I'm looking at Steve's username, you already have that in your database. That's why, okay, so.
We have a super big database of 300 million people.
Very cool. So I see, so the API doesn't really calculate it on demand, it just has a stored database.
Pre-calculated source. Awesome. Because the data for who you follow on Twitter is expensive data.
Yes.
In terms of getting that.
Right.
Maybe I shouldn't mention this on record, but we have it for this project we have a large set of APIs, credentials. So we collected all accounts who follow, for example, Obama, more than 100 Twitter users with all their characteristics.
Yes.
So you can imagine it's a super large data set.
Yeah.
And then, so we got this data and then we processed the data. So we calculated. So we had all the elites and users who follow them. But if we flip the coin, we have all the users and all, so we did this transformation in the database and then optimize the database, put it on a AWS server.
Yeah.
And then you can get all this information less than 0.3 seconds.
Wow.
For every user.
And is the API do you put a cap on the call so you can just call
we put a cap on the calls. It's like through Rapid API, but I think the cap is like 10,000 calls per day or something like that. And usually like people we need that, they can just like let us know and then we can raise that.
Yeah.
It's not, now that we have the whole infrastructure, it's not expensive for us to serve it out.
It's pretty amazing, pretty cool tool, yeah.
Awesome, that's pretty much for this project. So, we created this new measure for exposure to misinformation from political elites. We show that, it's highly aligned with other measures who are based on sharing from news domains. We identified characteristics of the followers of these questionable elites on other websites they share content from at the network level. And we show that there's asymmetry related to political ideology, people for right versus people in terms of exposure to misinformation. That was pretty much it.
Thank you.
Cool. Let's open this up for discussion. Zoom people, you can just raise your hand or just open your mic. I got a question if no one else thoughts. So basically this database is aggregating across what's the time range there?
For collecting the data.
For how long how far back do you go?
In terms of followership or
Yeah.
in terms of sharing content? Sharing content for every user is up to 3,200, which is capped by 200.
And followership? No, followership is
Followership doesn't have it.
Yeah. So my question, I'm trying to push out the next question, which is if I would like to see how people get radicalized or how they change over time. Basically, using this database, I would have to segment it by, or is it not possible to do such?
It's very difficult to find when they start following an elite, unless one way to do that is just keep following people,
Exactly.
followers, and then see when they are added.
Yes.
But unfortunately, Twitter doesn't return timestamp of following
When they
someone.
started
Yes,
following, yeah.
So that could be. But with the tweet we can.
Yeah. So to do this sort of network-based measure, you would need to collect the networks in every point of time, right? You need to recollect the network and see how it changes.
But
But
if you do it with retweet network or
Yeah.
share network, we can easily do that because
Right.
tweets have the
Templates.
timestamp exactly.
Yes.
So if you have enough history in the data, we can just collapse it into different timestamps and then we can destructure it.
Anybody online? Well, then I'll ask my question unless the hand is going up. One of the things that's fascinating here is that maybe it offers an opportunity to sort of look at causality. Because could you, hypothetically speaking, could you trace the behavior of a single user and identify the point at which they start sharing misinformation and see whether that coincides with them beginning to follow a certain elite? In other words, is there a way to make the point that the elites are providing cues that then make other people do certain things, which incidentally is what I think is going on. But of course, it's you can't infer causality from this just yet. But I'm wondering if there is anything in there that will allow you to do that.
The only thing is problem with that is to identify when they started following it.
Right, and you don't know that. You can't go back and the API doesn't tell you that.
No. One thing that we potentially can use is that at least at the current stage of time, it's time order. So if you
Right.
pull
Right.
people's follow account, they are in order of the time they follow that account. So somehow,
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
you don't have a timestamp, but it's their time order in their chronology.
So you can at least see like, at this point, they started following a bunch of, a certain type of account.
So if you have the same, for the same user, we can just, if you, let's say if you have a set of like 5,000 users already, we can follow all their behavior over time by just like taking a snapshot.
right.
And there are ways, I mean, technically, to see if they start following some new people, because the token you get from the API changes when they follow a new person. So if I pull someone's followers, accounts they follow at some point of time, next time I don't need to fetch all of their followers, I need to just look at the token from the API to see if the token changes, and then you can get the new followers.
And also you can probably get like some sort of a clue for if you look at the people they follow, and you have like when those people enter Twitter, right, when they created the account. So if for some reason you have like, you know, if there's a new account there and it's ranked, so you got like a clue.
Oh, then you have
can
sort of an
infer.
estimate of the time. Yeah, the problem, how reliable are those dates of when people join Twitter? Because I'm always a little bit skeptical of that when you look at trolls, obvious trolls, you know, people with the ABC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 handle, and they have 36 followers, and they're an egg, you know. And then it says join Twitter in June 2009. Well, I don't think they've been hanging around for 14 years.
They normally cycle them, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the way that I think about, I mean, there are two things we can look at that. One is the time they join, and also their user IDs.
Yeah.
The user ID, it started with some number and is increasing over time. It used to be 8-digit and now 16-digit. At some point they changed it to 16-digit. But that has a meaning. So if you look at the 16 digits, it hasn't, you can estimate when they were created from that digit, which even like which data center they are. So you can almost which region they created in terms of like Twitter. But then,
These are the not the handle,
Not
these
the
are the
handle, the
user
ID.
IDs within Twitter, the
Yeah.
internal, got it.
we can get that from the API. But maybe like many of these accounts are very creative, but they're very active.
Mm,
It's just like we're selling on the black market or something
Yeah.
like that.
yeah.
So I don't know. But we have seen things like that like accounts changing their screen names for various purposes.
Yes.
And then we have also observed accounts that were not active for a while, doing a certain amount of time, just became active. Maybe there's people selling them.
And there are some accounts that sort of activate once every year during a very specific time
Yeah.
period, because that's something we noticed when I worked at Bath. We worked with Twitter data around the World Vape Day, and we were looking at accounts, and there were some accounts that were literally just active annually around World Vape Day, and that was the only thing they ever did.
Sometimes they deactivate the account also. I don't know.
Yeah. So what's next? What direction are you heading in from here?
For this particular project, we had a couple of ideas. One was, using this app and then just like use, Twitter ads or like any form of application to spread the app. And then for users which, look up on our app and then look at the causality thing that you just mentioned.
Mhm.
So for even now, every time a user logs into our account, gets their misinformation exposure, whatever, we record their information. We haven't recorded their information. But we are not analyzing it we didn't.
So you've just given your information.
Well,
Right.
so we have the record of that. But we are not using it for any analysis purposes. But the one thing that we are thinking about that is just like spreading the word, and then see after getting misinformation exposure score, do people stop following someone? So the other way around, like you mentioned. It's kind of like creating a mirror for someone. This is my misinformation because of this account. Am I going to, stop following some?
But does it tell you? Does the app tell you what the sources are for you?
Yeah.
Because I didn't get that.
So
At the bottom, it tells you who are the ones that you're following and what their scores are.
so have you started going that direction? Because I suspect that you'll have some problems encountering Republicans and showing them like who they're following, saying, well, I don't think that my senator is a suspected of misinformation, right?
Even that kind would be interesting.
Right.
Just showing that, if you, I don't know, if ideally or like, you assume that like many people from left stop following many like problematic account of people on the right won't, and that would be also interesting.
And it would also be interesting to show them that either by the, you had two forms of validation, right, about whether it was through PolitiFact or whether it was through the lay people which are a representative sample. So it would be interesting to see if like people who get that feedback would trust more
That's interesting.
yeah the
crowd
experts
versus-
or the crowd. Yeah.
That's interesting. So I mean, that's one thing that we were thinking about, running an experiment with this app. Another one is also like looking at other contexts, like, in Europe, in other types of misinformation, which I'm not very familiar with, like climate misinformation, for example, and see like what are the people who are exposed to climate-related misinformation and what are the characteristics of these users, like health misinformation, things like basically using this machinery in other types of misinformation beyond political misinformation is another example.
Very cool. Seems to be taking a long time to think this time. Any other questions or comments?
Silence.
No, okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah,
That means we can have a lunch.
Yeah, we can do that. Right, so thanks again for listening.
Yeah.
And thank everyone, and I'll see most of you Friday.
Thank you, Mohsen. Have a good lunch.
Bye-bye.
Wow.
Bye.
Pity you can't join us. Bye.